So the first question is, why would you use a fan for seedling? The default answer to this is it reduces mold accumulation on top of the soil surface. It can limit dampening off after the seeds have germinated. And we tend to think that it makes a stronger seedling, but in more scientific terms, we can say develops structural tissues such as petioles, stems, and leaves. A fancy way of saying it. But how? How does it do this? That's the real question here. We like to look at this from a plant science perspective as eliminating the boundary layer of air surrounding a plant. Smaller boundary layers, meaning faster wind speeds, can give us a number of different benefits, such as increasing convective heat transfer, rates of transpiration, as well as CO2 assimilation. So let's break those three ideas down. The first one regarding heat simply means we are not allowing for hot spots in the plant's canopy, and simply moving air through there will allow for a more ambient temperature around the plant and not hot spaces, which can actually occur when we get more dense foliage on the plants themselves. The second concept of transpiration or evapotranspiration and expediting that truly comes down to the fact that if our plant is transpiring, meaning sweating, we are able to uptake more nutrients. The more water transfer taking place in a plant means more nutrient capture, more sugars being made, and ultimately more biomass being put on. So it can actually expedite the growth of your plant. And the last one being CO2 assimilation. So this simply means that plants, when they transpire, they uptake CO2. This uptaking of CO2 can take place regardless of the amount of CO2 available. However, if the plant is sitting in a stagnant air environment, there is a potential that they won't be able to uptake as much CO2 as they would if there was a constant flow of oxygen and CO2 molecules in and around the plant's foliage. So a fan in and of itself can just deliver more CO2 to those stomata for that plant to utilize. Now, we can even use a lower fan speed, maybe not necessarily to capitalize on things like temperature ranges, CO2 uptake, and just overall drying out of the plant or water fluctuations within the plant system, but just the simple movement of the leaves actually allows for light fluxes, as the scientists like to call it. Simply all this means is that that top upper canopy blowing in the wind allows for the light, in particular our grow lights, to move into that lower canopy region, allowing for even photosynthesis rather than a top-heavy plant. So this also goes for in greenhouses. If you're noticing your plants are looking a little thin on the bottom when it comes to leaves, the addition of just a light flow of air may be enough to give you more foliage on those bottom leaves. Another benefit that goes unnoted is how much it reduces your hardening off time, or how well these plants do without the hardening off process when they're exposed to this, only because they do have not only the structural integrity, but also their stomata and their guard cells in particular are used to an accelerated rate of evapotranspiration, meaning the plant system as a whole is adapted to very quick removals of water, which is what we tend to see when we see transplant shock in a lot of cases, when it's not related to the roots and is related to the foliage. So when exactly should you start using a fan on your seedlings? Well, the reality here is you do need to wait till after germination. Germination requires two really key features, and that is heat and intense humidity. This is why when we went over that video where we looked at different seedling doodads you can grab, two of the main things that I told you are needed are a warm space with either a heat mat over a register or just bringing the lights nice and close, all the way to the actual dome itself and the importance of that humidity. Once everything's germinated, however, you can add that fan. Now, I like to wait till I get some true leaves in place, but you could, typically speaking, throw that on as soon as you see those cotyledons. It's not going to disrupt the seedlings, and if anything, it's actually going to prevent against that dampening off we spoke about, as well as the mold formation on the soil surface. But if you're using vermiculite, you shouldn't have the mold situation regardless. So that's when we turn it on. But how long should we leave it on for? Well, there's two answers to that. The first one being until it's outdoors and exposed to constant air movement, and or if it's an indoor plant scenario, never. For the rest of that plant's life, you may want to consider utilizing that wind movement. And we'll get into kind of some of the features or the morpholic features that we tend to see with these plants when a fan is added to something such as a houseplant. The next answer to how long is actually a 24-hour cycle length. So I have a rule when it comes to plants, and it is to mimic nature as much as possible. And one of the greatest ways to mimic nature is to have that fan turn off at the same time that your lights turn off, meaning 12 hours on, 12 hours off. Nighttime, usually there isn't much for wind. There's maybe some circumstances in which that wouldn't apply, but for the most part, wind tends to calm down. This means you don't have to run the fans at night. And I actually do hook them both up to the same timer because timers I get have the 2 outlets. And this allows for them to turn on and turn off at the same time, mimicking Mother Nature indoors. So there's 2 types of fans you could technically get. There's an oscillating fan, meaning a fan that either moves up and down, side to side, or just a standard straight fan. Now, I don't know where oscillating fans exist anymore. Maybe on Amazon they exist, but for me personally, all I've ever been able to find is just a direct push of air. I don't find it to be much of an issue, but if you have plants that you know are going to be exposed to more intense winds or fluctuating levels of winds in a more exposed environment, I actually would opt into the oscillating fan whenever possible, only because that kind of movement of air from all directions will ultimately encourage a more even disbursement of said structural features of the plant: petioles, stems, and leaves. For those of you growing in a backyard, sheltered balcony, or you're going to choose to stake or trellis in some way, a straight on fan will work just fine. That's what I use. That's what I've always used. So the next thing to actually consider is direction. So the direction of the wind matters here. If you want a more short and stout plant, and or you're looking for more foliage development in the lower levels of your plant, so on the lower stems, this may apply to more so the houseplant people, you would want the plant fan coming downwards onto the plant. This will reduce the actual internode sections and overall give you more plant or light flux into those lower foliage, ultimately giving you a bushier plant. The next way to do this is actually to bring the fan from below, and there are some benefits to this, but in very rare circumstances would it ever be needed. Now, the most classic and typical way of applying a fan is just from the side, and that's the way I apply it. This is going to give us the benefits of the CO2 exchange, express rates of evapotranspiration, combined with just overall light flux throughout that entire canopy. So you guys have to let me know in the comments down below what you opt for when it comes to fan speed, low or high, as well as if you're coming from the side and if you're shutting that fan off at night or you just let it rip for 24 hours until those bad boys get outdoors. I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.